Hello, everyone, and welcome to our forum today, focusing on the business of reaching net zero emissions in Asia. My name is Dan Vermeer, and I'm an associate professor at Duke University in the Fuqua School of Business and the director for the Center for Energy Development in the Global Environment. Since we began planning this event several months ago, the world has turned upside down. Our original intention was to organize an in-person summit on climate change in business with a focus on Asia. And we envisioned this to be a large gathering of students and faculty that would spend a couple of days together, exploring the importance of climate change to every aspect of business, every function, and every region globally. While we had to scale back the dimensions of the form and the format of this event, we still aspire to change the way that you think about climate change in business. This event is part of a series that we organized starting in 2018 called the ClimateCAP Summits. We've hosted 2 events in the US so far at Duke University and at University of Virginia, and we plan to host the next one at Northwestern University in Chicago next year. We see a real need as well as a real appetite among students to understand how the systemic impacts of climate change affect us not only personally, physically, politically, but also in real ways, the business environment that many of you hope to work in eventually. So today, I'd like to focus on setting up the conversation, recognizing that we're living in a period of incredible disruptive change. We see a convergence of a variety of stresses on our systems. Right now, many of us are hunkered down at home with not much happening. But meanwhile, the world is lit up by a convergence of at least 4 interacting crises. The COVID-19 pandemic, which as of today has affected over 120 million people, resulting in almost 2.7 million deaths. The economic collapse that's associated with that, playing out unevenly across countries and communities, and strangely bifurcated between people who are wealthy, who have been relatively less impacted by COVID, and massive unemployment, economic loss, and human suffering for much of the rest of society. In the US, this is accompanied by the eruption of racial conflict and unrest. And finally, climate change, which didn't go away in the pandemic and continues to hurtle forward at a sort of breathtaking pace. This has been the hottest year on record, with forest fires, loss of sea ice, and all of the other signals. And with every passing year, the impacts grow. I think what's clear is that these converging crises require more than siloed approaches. We really need an approach that can multitask and multi-solve against these various challenges. So many of you are familiar with the IPCC's special report that came out in 2018 that assessed the impact of 2 degrees Celsius change in climate and the differential if we are able to hold it to 1.5. And what that study demonstrated was the massive difference in even that half a degree would make in terms of long-term incomes and ability to continue to feed and support the kind of populations globally. The report really drove home that the speed and scale of transformation is breathtaking. In order to limit to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the world needs to halve CO2 emissions by around 2050 and reach net zero by mid-century. Delay would be fatal, and differences in impacts between 1.5 and 2 degrees are profound. And so this has set off, I think, a global race to net zero emissions, which I would define as a state in which greenhouse gas emissions no longer accumulate in the atmosphere and is reached when anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases are balanced by removals over a specified period. So for those who have been in the field for a while, this curve that you see in the chart looks familiar, but the curve is steeper than what we've seen in the past. And what's really notable here is not just a radical decarbonization of our economy to achieve net zero, but the absolute requirement that we find ways of achieving negative emissions. So the game has changed and gotten even more challenging. Oh, excuse me. So in the world of energy, signs of change are everywhere. Coal, for the first time on record, has declined as in terms of total size of the fleet during 2020, with more generation capacity shutting down soon. Renewables, the cost of renewables and energy storage are coming down dramatically, creating a real appetite globally for increasing the kind of investment in renewables. EVs in cities around the world that are setting now limits on internal internal combustion vehicles is driving real innovation in this sector. We've seen rapid growth in climate tech, new technology that can address climate change, and a kind of a new emphasis on nature-based solutions, finding ways of engaging with nature in ways that can reduce or remove emissions. In fact, the pace of all of these things is accelerating dramatically. We can also see in the world of companies and countries that the scale of impact that they're seeking to achieve is also growing by the day. Microsoft is well known for their commitment to eliminate not just their current emissions, but their historic emissions going back to 1975. Amazon has recently set out very ambitious goals. Google, Walmart, many other companies almost every day are making commitments to achieve net zero emissions. China itself has set out a pledge to be carbon neutral by 2060. And so we see a global movement in this direction. Not always clear what the definition of net zero that companies are using, however. So in this slide, there's actually several different dimensions of what people mean when they talk about net zero emissions. They vary in terms of the scope. Does it include just carbon, or does it include other greenhouse gases and other climate impacts? The scope of activities that are being committed to, whether it's just the enterprise itself or its broader supply chain or value chain, its products. In terms of the mitigation strategy, is that strategy based on abatement of emissions, negative emissions, or avoided emissions? And finally, are they setting goals for 2050, a kind of long-range goal that they don't necessarily know the pathway to get there, or are there interim targets that will lead them along the way? I'll wrap up just by pointing out a few of the highlights that I see that I'd like to sort of set up the conversation today. These convergent crises are creating a real sense of urgency and a recognition of interconnectedness. And so I think we're at a kind of a new state that's partly driven by COVID, but also many other drivers that are converging to accelerate the pace. On climate, corporate leadership is a moving target, but the pace is clearly accelerating, and it's being driven by increasing expectations of employees and other stakeholders in the business that want more policy engagement, want more ambitious targets. Issues of environmental, social, and racial justice are also moving front and center. So the idea of climate justice, I think, is now on the radar for companies and in societies in ways that it wasn't previously. What we do know is that the pace of climate performance, though, is not keeping up with the stated intentions and aren't actually robust enough to achieve the kind of goals that we know we need to achieve. There's a lot of confusion in the media around what net zero and carbon neutral and the terms that we're using actually mean. We see clean energy commitments that are evolving, where previously it might have been focused on renewable energy credits, but increasingly moving toward science-based targets and other operational reductions. With more focus on scope 3 or broader supply chain, value chain emissions. And that these net zero commitments are stimulating significant interest in carbon removal. which I think is actually the sign of kind of the emergence of a whole new industry. And in fact, this is my fundamental belief about climate change is it certainly creates risks. It will create a lot of, very difficult situations for the world, but it's an enormous catalyst for innovation and for the growth of new industries, which aren't only nice to have, they're essential for us to be able to move into the 21st century in a way that allows us to be healthy and prosper. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to Jackson Ewing, who is going to kick off today's discussion and panel. I'm thrilled to have all of you here, and I'm also thrilled to have our panelists for a really great and timely discussion. So thanks for being here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Dan, for that excellent introduction and for your leadership in the founding and continued execution of the ClimateCAP initiative, seeking to further mainstream these climate considerations, which you've just discussed, and others into the thinking of the private sector and business. We're really thrilled to be able to bring some of this work to our colleagues in Asia and those here in the West who are interested in the developments there. As Dan said, of Jackson Ewing, I hold dual appointments at Duke and Duke Kunshan University. I am a senior fellow at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions and the faculty lead for the International Masters of Environmental Policy program at Duke Kunshan University. On that note, I'd like to thank both the Nicholas Institute, the Edge Center at Fuqua School of Business, led by Dan and colleagues, and the Environmental Research Center at Duke Kunshan for helping make this panel and ensuing discussion possible. As Dan mentions, the raft of net zero commitments that we've seen over the past 18 months is really putting this issue front and center in our conversation over climate change mitigation and how we can balance our continuing emissions with the realities of the necessity of addressing their emissions results. In Asia, much of the necessary action towards net zero will take place in business sectors, both state-controlled and private, domestic and international. And we're going to hear about some of that tonight from a panel that I'm very excited to introduce. First, we have Casper Chikwe. He's the environmental products originator at BP. He's joining us from Shanghai, and he's been based in China in various roles since the mid-2000s. Qian Wu is the consulting director for sustainability strategy for China, including the Special Administrative Region of Hong Kong at PricewaterhouseCoopers. She's based in Beijing. And Rachel Fleischman is the head of partnerships for Carbonless Asia, a rapidly growing innovation platform specializing in technology solutions to help decarbonize Asia. Rachel joins us from Hong Kong, where she's been based for over a decade. I'm going to quickly get out of these speakers' way, but before I do so, I want to make a couple of logistical announcements. One is that we're going to take a conversational tone throughout, so please feel free to submit questions as we go at any time via the Q&A function, which you'll see on the bottom middle part of your screen. For those of you who might not have seen it or taken advantage of it already and wish to, we also are providing simultaneous translation into Chinese, which you can find through the icon on the bottom right hand of your screen. We will integrate your questions and inputs in our conversation, both during the interventions of the individual panel members and towards the latter part of the session itself. So without any further delay, Casper, I want to start with you. As I said, BP, one of the world's largest energy companies, declared net zero emissions goals in February of last year. What have been some of the company-wide ripple effects?
Thanks, Jackson, and thanks a lot for having me today. So the net zero announcement in February last year, I have to admit it came as a surprise to most of us, even within BP. The surprise, I think, was mostly about the timing of the announcement, about the scope of our ambitions, and how clearly Bernard Looney and the new leadership team articulated them. So it was really interesting. It was that leadership transition from Bob Dudley to Bernard Looney, and one of the first things that Bernard did was announcing our net zero ambition. So that was really interesting. I think what it means for the company following the announcement was I think a lot of ongoing restructuring efforts to support the company in the entire energy transition.
Casper, I believe you're frozen if you can hear me. Okay. Well, Casper, you froze for a moment, but you're back.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, great.
I was about to skip on to the next speaker, so it's good.
Yeah, okay. Just in time.
All right, just in time.
Yeah. So one of the major implications from the announcements, I think, was it kicked off an ongoing restructuring effort within the company to make sure that the company is ready for the energy transition and to meet the aims that we've set out for ourselves. And I think these are very wide-reaching restructuring efforts. So originally we were organized as most other oil and gas companies with an upstream and downstream. But what the new leadership team and Bernard Looney did was essentially do away with this distinction between upstream and downstream and have more integrated business units that try to bring the different businesses together in the context of the energy transition. Now, I think the announcement for the immediate team I am in, which is the low carbon trading, it's been great, obviously. So we see a lot of, I think, increased support for the kind of projects and activities that we are doing in low carbon. But I think at the same time, it's important to recognize that for many of my colleagues, it was I think a very challenging announcement, because I think on a very fundamental level, it does question the future of the hydrocarbon business that we're in. And I think what the leadership team and Bernard Looney did very well, I think it was throughout the whole process, during the announcement of our ambitions, and then through the entirety of the last year, very consistent and very thoughtful messaging that we remain focused on hydrocarbons, that we want to focus on the most resilient and the most valuable of our projects. And the implication from that is, I think, two things. It is less volume. So in absolute terms, I think the hydrocarbon business will shrink over time, but it remains an extremely important part of the business, and it is essentially where all the cash flow comes from that enables us to do more in renewable energy and in the energy transition. So I think that was the message, and I think it worked very well, I think, to address some of the concerns from people working, on the oil rigs or in exploration, and to address some of their concerns. And then I think it also kicked off a lot of increased activities in the securing and sourcing of projects in renewable energy. So you may have seen some of the announcements around our large-scale projects in the US, offshore wind in Europe as well, very large investments in biogas in Latin America, for example. And for us, for our team in carbon, so we do a lot of projects in, for example, afforestation or reduced deforestation across the globe. And we can do that at a much larger scale than we did before.
Yeah, thanks, Casper. You know, the fact that this announcement took you by surprise as someone who's been working in the environmental products segment for many years is quite interesting and surprising in its own right. You know, is this the case of trying to set a goalpost and then determine strategy beneath that, and to have the goalposts really inform and drive ambition, and then sort of fill in with the actual techniques through this combination of offsetting activities in the hydrocarbon sector and expanding activities elsewhere?
I think it's a combination of both setting the goalpost, but I think that setting of the goalpost was informed by I think an understanding of where the company is and what's realistic to achieve. So I think it's both. So we don't, obviously, by the time Bernard Looney made the announcement a year ago, we didn't have all the details figured out. But he was reasonably certain that it was a realistic goal, and I think already had a vision how to achieve our ambition. But you're right, I think now it is really about figuring out the detailed implementation plans, coming up with interim targets, and we already announced some of the interim targets for 2030. But this needs to be broken down now into more near-term targets for the next couple of years, what it means in terms of budgeting, in terms of you know, investments, in terms of building teams. So that's really how it works. So I think you're right about that.
Thanks. I also want to pick up on something else you said in your initial statement about this upstream downstream integration. You know, in Dan's opening comments, he talked about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And I think many of us, and I'll count myself among them, are sometimes guilty of categorizing fairly strictly at times in those terms, as far as the emissions resulting from your operations, the emissions resulting from your supply chains, the emissions resulting from the use of your products, which for hydrocarbons is particularly important. You talk about kind of a more integrated approach that sounds like it might be eroding some of those divisions. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, sure. So I think in terms of our aims and the net zero target, I think the general logic of scope 1 and 2 and scope 3, I think that still applies. So I think this is not directly related to the restructuring we do, but I think the restructuring does enable us to look more holistically at our operational emissions, and the focus obviously lies. So that's where we start. We start with our operational emissions, and that's where we want to reduce absolute emissions. And I think the integration puts more of a focus on the entirety of the value chain. It used to be very much focused on exploration and on our oil fields. And I think now we're more looking at the entire value chain in terms of operational emissions. And then I think when we look at the scope 3 or the life cycle emissions of the products that we sell, there I think this is probably the most challenging part for the energy industry, because in the end it's our customers that decide how our products are used, and it's customer demand that in a way influences our strategic decisions, where we prioritize and what we want to supply. So there is really about working with our customers, I think, in the first step, to make them understand what is the environmental impact of the products that we sell, and then helping them, working with them to reduce essentially the carbon footprint of the product mix that they're using. And that can be by transitioning from high intensity products to lower intensity products. So that's why LNG, for example, is going to be a very important piece of the transition. It's not the end goal, but it's part of the solution for the whole transition. And also offsets. So that's where I think carbon offsets come into play, where we supplement our products with carbon offsets to help our customers in the transition towards net zero.
Thanks. I want to pick up on both of those last 2 points, and we'll start with LNG. How important are life cycle analyses on things like LNG supply chains becoming? I mean, we're hearing more and more about that, including from some fairly traditional companies, CNOOC in China, for example. The Cheniers in Texas are all becoming more and more vocal about trying to effectively measure and ultimately reduce the methane emissions and other environmental externalities from their larger supply chains. And the argument here is that LNG is a vital bridge fuel and a vital decarbonization tool and a pathway, and that ultimately we could even gain some kind of offset credit from fuel switching to LNG. So can you let us know a bit more about how you see those LCA issues? Yeah,
I think they're absolutely crucial. I think it does not apply only to LNG, but LNG I think is at the forefront of that development, and we've seen already, you mentioned a few of those names. We have already seen, I think by now it's around 10 cargoes of carbon offset LNG, and mostly in Asia, interestingly. So I think this is going to be a very important development going forward. The challenge at the moment, I think, is it's still very early stage, so there is no standardization. So every transaction essentially has to do its own life cycle analysis of the particular cargo. That's part of the transaction, which is, I mean, it's a lot of effort, obviously, but it also puts a lot of uncertainties on both the seller and the buyer. For the seller, we need to, if we sell what we call carbon offset LNG, then we need to make sure that we have reasonable confidence in the emission calculation that we make. And for the buyer, it's reputational issues. So they say they procure carbon offset LNG, but how can they be sure that the calculations are correct? And what I believe what will happen is that the same thing that we've seen in carbon markets in general is that this will move towards a standardized framework where it's third parties that come up with the calculations. There will be standardized methodologies, and there will be third parties that provide assurance around these calculations. And I think that's where we need to move to make this scalable. But I think absolutely, I do think that this will be a very important part of the transition. And I think it helps with two things. It helps for buyers and for consumers of fossil fuels. It helps to understand what is the externality, what is the carbon footprint of the products that they use. And if you offset it, then it helps to channel investments into low carbon projects and into low carbon technology to help us getting quicker to net zero. So I think there's two benefits to that, and I think both are equally important.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. And these LCA calculations are certainly no simple thing. When you start to look at all of the embedded emissions through extraction, through conversion to LNG, and then conversion back into usable fuel and transportation through, in many cases, shipping, very wide ranges of ultimate impact there. And as you say, the veracity of those calculations is extremely important, and the confidence that we can take from them as well. I want to transition to some of where you landed on that, on the importance of carbon markets and offsetting. And I know that this is an area of real specialty for you, and it's what's brought us together and some work together in the past. And I actually think that one of the audience members has asked a better question than I was planning to. So I'm going to go. I'm going to defer to Winston here, who asked, how are conglomerates in Asia, including BP in the climate division, guaranteeing additionality? And if you would please explain briefly additionality for our audience. For your purchased carbon offsets. They're increasingly common, but are susceptible to criticisms of greenwashing. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the concept of additionality is, I think, is most relevant for mitigation projects. Mitigation essentially means you're looking at a certain baseline of activities, and you anticipate that this practice will continue into the future. And then comes your carbon project, intervenes, you make an investment and reduce your emissions against that baseline. And that's why you need to argue that this activity or your investment activity is additional to what would have happened in a business as usual scenario. So that's the whole concept of additionality. And it's a discussion that's been going on for 2 decades now, I think. It's very tricky to come up with absolute, unassailable proofs for additionality because you're talking about essentially a virtual baseline scenario, right? That's something that you imagine that would happen, but it's very difficult to compare it to what's actually happening. And very often criticism for offset projects is backward looking. So people say, so for example, for renewable energy, they say, well, look at all these renewable energy projects that were invested over the last decade, for example, in absence of carbon finance. That means the projects you did back then were not additional, but that's actually not true, because at the moment when those projects had to make their investment decision, first of all, you may argue that there is an absolute argument against the kind of returns that the investor expects, and you need carbon finance to meet a certain investment benchmark. But then the second more important argument, I think, is an argument of opportunity cost, where you say you have to go for carbon finance simply because it's an option out there, and if you don't do it, then you're less competitive than your competitors. I think these are some of the considerations more theoretical about additionality. For us, when we procure offsets, I think we have internal standards that are more strict than most of the voluntary standards out there. So we will impose additional, for example, vintage restrictions, or there are certain technologies that we will try to avoid for the voluntary market or for voluntary buyers, or for our own products that we offset with voluntary offsets. For compliance markets, we have a different stance, and I think that's very important to understand. So for compliance markets, we believe that whatever is compliant or whatever can be used to meet the compliance, that's what we go with. So I think that's very important, because compliance markets only work if they're liquid, if they're standardized, and if they're transparent. And one of the things that happened, for example, in China, in the emission trading pilots that China has been operating for the last 7 years now, is that you had a national standard. It was not very strict. You can argue it was not strict enough, but then all the regional pilots imposed their additional eligibility criteria on top of the national standard, and that led to a fragmentation of the market. And fragmentation of the market is worse than having the perfect standard, because it leads to additional transaction costs, confusion for project developers, for market participants, higher less liquidity, so much higher market risk. So for compliance markets, we fully believe in supporting whatever the compliance standard is. If we believe it's not sufficient, then we will engage in dialogue with the standard setter. But in terms of procurement and using offsets under a compliance market, we will go with whatever the standard says.
Yep, thanks for that really, really deep and substantive answer, Casper. I would really come to regret it if I didn't take advantage of having you on this panel without asking you a little bit of a more drilled down question on China's national ETS, particularly in light of what you've just said about fragmentation. China's national ETS effort has been many years in the making, but without rehashing that story, it has come into legal force as of the beginning of February this year, with the expectation that we'll likely see active trading at some point in this summer. Is that going to address some of those fragmentation issues you see? What are some of the key considerations that you, as someone at the helm of BP's efforts to operate within this market, are thinking about right now?
I think that's right. I think it will address some of the issues with the regional markets. The regional markets are very, I think, dissimilar. So you have two large schemes in provinces in Guangdong and Hubei, and then the rest, Fujian, arguably it's a bit smaller, and then the rest are municipal schemes and are typically too small to reach economies of scale. And the national scheme is going to change that by unifying the entire market for the power sector. Going forward, we'll have one single emission trading scheme for the entire country. And I think that will already by itself solve a lot of the problems that we've seen in the pilot market. So we will have more liquidity because there's more participants. Will be one uniform market, so no distractions, also no opportunities for arbitrage between the markets. That doesn't make sense. The environment does not gain from that. I think in terms of project finance, I think in the first couple of years, it's likely that the carbon price is too low to make a huge difference in terms of investments into, let's say, mitigation projects or into renewable energy. So I think the key goal for the first couple of years is really getting everybody into the system, making sure that the compliance cycle works, and then once you have everybody participating, then you can tighten the allocation and increase the carbon price. And I think once it reaches, let's say, for example, 100 RMB or 150 RMB, or roughly $20, I think that's when you will start seeing real, behavioral changes in terms of investments.
Yeah, thanks. I completely agree, unsurprisingly there, and would just add that I think that strictness and cost as it pertains to the activity of the covered entities is also relative to the other regulations that they're facing, right? And
yeah,
there
that's right.
to be an appetite in China, and specifically with the authorities that are designing and now operating the national ETS, to get those structures in place that can be strengthened over time. While in the near term, it might be regulations on more conventional pollution or total energy use, or targets for the deployment of alternative energy consumption, et cetera, that are more front of mind for them because they're more onerous. They're more difficult to meet. Well, thanks so much, Casper, and we will certainly hear more from you as our discussion continues. One final thing I would just like to comment on that you mentioned before we head to our next speaker is that you talked about the kind of nebulous nature, the vague nature sometimes of reducing from a business as usual scenario, and how that doesn't give you the hardest target. And you gave some private sector examples of that. I would just point out, I think that's a fundamental part of the net zero conversation at national levels as well, alongside environmental markets issues. I mean, the Korean ETS, for example, is based on a business as usual standard. China's own ETS is not on a BAU, but it's on efficiency-based targets, which means that we don't have the kind of hard cap that gives us that predictability of where our absolute emissions are likely to land. And one point of disappointment for some environmental observers from the recent release of China's outline of its 14th five-year plan was that it also did not include a hard emissions cap. while it did allude to the possibility of one in the future. So this is fundamental to net zero discussions, I submit, because by their very nature, you're talking not about reducing your emissions to zero, you're talking about reducing your emissions to a balance with removals ultimately. And where that ultimate equilibrium might happen is unknown, and is something that will have that same kind of uncertainties potentially along the way. Thanks for seeding that in our conversation, and perhaps we can carry that forward in the discussion itself. One note to our participants: I have seen a hand or two raised. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box, and I will send them onward to the speakers, which we're just doing for efficiency reasons. I want to now move on to Rachel, who I introduced earlier as the head of partnerships for Carbonless Asia. And Rachel, I don't want to bury the lead here. It's an important moment for Carbonless Asia. You're set to launch officially later this month. Can you tell us what you and your team there are going to be doing?
Sure, thanks, and it's great to be here this morning with you and the group online. So thanks for the invitation. So Carbonless Asia, in 5 words, is Asia's first carbon tech venture capital firm. But in reality, it's a lot more than that. And we say we're first, we haven't launched yet. So it could be that if someone launches later today, we won't be first. But I think the business model's got some interesting twists to it that I want to share. First of all, it's really based on a business matching program between corporates with ambitious carbon targets, usually leading institutions in their fields, and tech startups sourced from around the world. So at the core is, what are the key challenges in Asia, particularly in energy, property and development, agricultural, and food supply chain. Those are sort of the big carbon emitters. What are the key challenges all along the value chain? Where is carbon leakage happening? And then matching tech startups to help solve those challenges with, could be technology, could be materials, could be software, could even be business model changes. How do we solve those problems? Piloting those, and then the VC firm invests in those. So it's less like a beauty contest and more like an Olympic tryout for the startups. The other piece of it is that we don't tend to do this sort of in secret behind closed doors, which is often how these discussions between companies and their future suppliers take place. We really want to, once we find solutions that work, amplify those, share them with others in the industry to accelerate the decarbonization in Asia, because if it doesn't work here, it's not going to work globally. If it does work here, we'll move much more quickly and efficiently towards our carbon goals. And yes, the investors will make money too.
Thanks, Rachel. Given that you all are launching now and that you've been working in these issues in the region for some time, I'm really interested to hear about what changes you've seen. We've been talking about this NetZero Push as kind of an operative moment for the scaling of sustainability efforts in private sector and business operations in the region. How is that different from, say, the late 2000s or early 2010s?
Yeah, so it's sort of been a very slow awakening. So I do a few things here in Hong Kong. One of them is I convene an informal sustainability professionals practitioners group. We call this the Breakfast Club. We don't use the S word, but we basically have been trading war stories and supporting each other for the last 10 years. And for a long time, a lot of the challenges that we were facing and sharing and solving together were getting the businesses to understand how to go beyond reporting. I'm hearing an echo. Are you hearing an echo as well?
I'm hearing you fine, but carelessly was not muted myself, so let me fix that. We'll see if that helps at all. Please.
So there's this learning curve that businesses tend to take, or that we've been sort of tracking, where, you know, sort of going along and then, oh, I have to do a sustainability report for my investors or for my stock exchange. Oh, I have to gather this data. Oh, it's painful. Okay, I'm reporting the data. Oh, I can use this data to you know, reduce costs, improve efficiencies, lower my cost of energy, my cost of waste. Oh, well, now the investors are starting to ask questions. You know, so there's this sort of in this slow awakening. And what's happened, I think, over the last 6 to 8 months since this proliferation of net zero commitments from 120 plus countries, from hundreds and hundreds of companies, is that all of a sudden boards woke up and said, wow, this is me. Like my staff is asking, my investors are asking, my regulators are demanding that I have some, you know, that I do scenario testing in the future to see what my climate change exposure is. It's not just about mitigation, it's about protecting assets and supply chains, and yikes, you know. So there's been this sort of rude awakening after this slow period, which is good, actually. And now I think there's, particularly with the engagement of the financial sector and the recognition that smart money is going to be investing in businesses and supply chains that are ready for a future carbon constrained world, and climate adapted world, because resilience is a big deal here. Asia is the region of the world where we have more people and more assets exposed to devastating potential climate impacts than anywhere else, and we're least prepared. And that it's not just about the business within your gates, it's really about your supply chain, because if you lose one critical supplier, then you know, there goes the company. And then the other thing is that I think, so boards are waking up. I actually had the Asia head of a boutique consulting firm approach me, take me out to a very expensive tea recently, and he said, you know, these boards that I advise, you know, they want to do something about sustainability, but you know, they're really not sure what to do, and but they see the advantage of cheap money. So the whole concept of, you know, sort of green bonds, which is not actually cheap money, but the fact that investors are starting to demonstrate that they have higher trust and therefore are de-risking investments in companies that have coherent sustainability plans that are not just on paper, but are in action and have proof of concept, and are extending again beyond the gates of the firm and upstream to the suppliers, downstream to customers, and are communicating that well, and are demonstrating that they're on the learning curve, they're making progress, they're learning, they're integrating those learnings, they're continuously improving. It really raises the bar for everybody else. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I'll pause there.
Well, you've given us a lot to chew on there, Rachel. I'm going to go over just a little bit of it. You talked about how companies now are moving towards more sustainable actions for the strategic value of the data that they acquire through those activities, their reputational value that they can gain, and that the poor reputational impact that they can avoid, the demands from their consumers, the potential for them to attract new investment. You know, on that note, it's been interesting. I've seen some analysis that during the period of stock market activity globally covering the pandemic, companies with higher ESG, environmental social governance ratings, have outperformed the market, the medium itself. Just a little quick sort of anecdote in support of what you're talking about there. And, you know, also the importance of reducing risk to supply chains, infrastructure resilience, et cetera. So the reason I parrot back this laundry list of issues to you is to ask you an organizational behavior question here. That's covering a really wide, arguably comprehensive set of departments, of operations within some of these companies that you've been working with and will be working with, certainly Carbonless Asia in the future. How do you then conceive of and functionally, pragmatically manage sustainability and climate issues across such a wide range of activities? And where does it lead you to having a, sort of a coherent set of strategies, or rather more of a kind of a highly differentiated, broader pool of activities that's happening in all these different places? Or is that the wrong distinction altogether?
I'm glad you said highly differentiated and not chaotic, because that's sometimes how it feels.
You read between the lines there, Rachel.
Closed caption for the hearing impaired. So I think what is most useful, and I have to credit BASF for this. I spent almost 7 years with the German chemical firm BASF, heading sustainability in Asia. And there I learned, and I became an evangelist of actually tracking sustainability metrics along a value chain from as far upstream as you can, extraction of raw materials from the earth or from nature, all the manufacturing steps, logistics, whatever production goes on within the firm, and then however far down the value chain you can continue to track. And you can look at water, you can look at waste, you can look at energy emissions, et cetera. You can track toxins, you can track time efficiency. And that process, that discipline of tracking along a value chain and visualizing it and putting numbers and figures, that's extremely helpful for understanding where there's opportunities to improve carbon, energy efficiency, waste, material reduction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where you start. You start by doing the homework. And I became, the person that was always yelling at everybody to do the homework. And then I would, of course, help them do the homework, because it's not something that's easy to do if you've never done it before. We were fortunate, we had a great internal team. I used to call them our inner McKinsey, I'm sorry, Chin, that actually helped to do the calculations, because as you alluded earlier, life cycle assessments is both art and science. And there's better and better data that's out there that you can use actually to improve, particularly if you're estimating externally. So you have to do that homework, and then you have to actually say, okay, at each node where there's inefficiencies, what can I do? And then you have to sort of zoom into each of those, and then zoom out again and say, okay, this is my supply chain now has 17 links. Can I get it down to 15? And we were able to do that a couple of times. Even something as simple as we used to make paint. We didn't call it paint, it was called coatings for cars. So BASF manufactured the 7 layers of coatings that go into your car that last the life of your car, if it's 5 years, 10 years. And protect it from rust and weather and all the rest. And they were able to take 2 steps out of that process. So 2 fewer layers of coatings that went onto the car and provide the same level of protection. And they won all sorts of awards for that. And that's because they weren't just thinking about where the inefficiencies were, they actually were combining functionalities as you would do in packaging, as you do it in medicine, we did it in coatings. So sometimes you have to actually change the business model. That business model changed as well, because they went from selling cans of paint or vats of paint to actually doing the spraying process itself. It took a product, became a service. Once the product became a service, it was in our interest as BASF to make sure that not a drop of that paint was wasted. So it was, maximizing efficiency. And the customer got exactly what they wanted, which is a fully manicured car, if you would. My colleagues would shoot me if I said that, but they're not on the phone. But that's the point, is really first track, sort of map your value chain, see where the leakage is, make it as efficient as possible, then step back and say, okay, what could I be doing different in terms of business model, in terms of shortening the chain, making the whole process more efficient, the products more durable, and making sure at the end of life that the leftover materials could be circled back into another high value activity.
Thanks. I was hoping that you would get into your BASF story, because that's one of the places I wanted to take our conversation. When we've spoken before, you mentioned something that I think is really important to our net zero conception and how we think about progress. And that is that not all sectors are created equal here at all. And that you have some industrial sectors, including chemicals, where BASF in particular is very, it's core business, that are going to be very difficult to abate. and that also play into, again, some of these complicated life cycle analyses that both you and Casper have discussed. I know you've really started to answer this question already in the comments that you just concluded, but I wonder if you can go just a little bit further before we move on to our final speaker about how you reconcile really difficult to abate sectors, whether we need to have to what extent we need to have the appetite for continuing emissions indefinitely from some of these sectors, and if so, how we might think about removals, offsets, etc.
Wow, if I had the answer to that, I would be in Chin's job. So let me just take a stab at that. I think obviously there are sectors that are more difficult to abate than others. And there are some sectors, and particularly energy, of course, where progress in that sector is going to enable all the others. Let me step back and say what companies have done until now in this part of the world, many companies, and what we shouldn't do is say, okay, well, I just run my factory. All I need is for the grid to be clean, and then I'll just be a clean company. Change my energy mix and I'll go back to sleep. That's not the answer. Really, there are probably half a dozen major issues around material use, waste, and feedback loops around actually planetary boundaries and species extinction, ocean acidification that won't work that model if that's everybody's attitude. Can we get where we're going? I'm an optimist, actually. There's some amazing things going on right now in hydrogen, in battery storage. We're going to have to be realistic about our assessments. And here, I think the other panelists may want to comment about what's the carbon footprint of a battery and how long should it, what does its life have to be? And what does its end of life disposition have to be in order to make sure that it actually is saving material and energy for the duration of its life? There's some issues around the components of that battery and how they're procured and how available they are and which countries have them. I mean, it's very, very complicated, but there is some the tech challenges are getting solved. So it's really a matter of figuring out where that's happening, trialing them in different applications, sometimes hopping across industries or across different parts of the supply chain, scaling those efficiencies and improvements as quickly as we can, but not, keeping the cycle going because we haven't got all the answers yet. We're going to have to do continuous improvement, but really quickly. That's the Olympic trials analogy from earlier on. And we've wasted a lot of time until now. So it's great this moment is happening, but we're sort of 15 years behind where we need to be right now.
Well, thanks for ending there.
On such a positive note.
Well, you give us inspiration to accelerate all of our respective efforts. Your point on procurement in the battery example is, I think, a really important one. You have some unexpected voices like those from Rio Tinto, the mining giant, calling out, look, if you're talking about this major expansion in storage, battery-based storage and renewable energy creation among those other supply chains that you mentioned with the environmental externalities we're trying to avoid beyond net zero, it's going to be an expansion in mining. And so those issues will already become much more important. Thank you for all of those comments. Again, we can return to some of them in our final wrap-up Q&A discussion. I want to now turn to Qian Wu, who I introduced earlier, Consulting Director for Sustainability Strategy for China at PwC. Qian, apologies for keeping you waiting. First of all, Qian was intended to be our first speaker. We encountered some technical difficulties on our side, so we've had her waiting in the wings. So thank you very much for being patient. Qian, I want to ask you a similar question to that which I asked Rachel just a few moments ago. You've been helping companies in China and beyond on their sustainability strategies for several years. What kinds of changes have you seen, and have the recent net zero targets made by China impacted company behaviors?
Thanks, Jackson. I think today is not my best Zoom day, so if I froze again, so please bear for maybe 5 to 8 seconds. Yeah, thanks for the question. Indeed, I think one of the reflection I had in the past 12 to 18 months is we get busier and busier and busier. The business is a good thing, but I think there's a strong increase from the business to get to know what exactly it is. They might heard it before, but what does that mean for their business, and what kind of implication on their business? I think they didn't, the companies didn't take serious before, but now they do. They realize what they've done is not good enough, because they found it difficult to justify to their investors why they haven't report on their carbon emission, for example, or why they don't have the document or policy in place to kind of manage their sustainability issues. So I think thanks to the investors, or the market awakening, as the previous speakers mentioned about. And they now have to justify more on what they thought they done good, and also I think maybe thanks to the pandemic, in a way that they become they start to realize it's you have to plan for the longer future. That's the scenario analysis we were talking about. So usually company do strategy plan for the Chinese company, you do the 5-year cycle, right? The 5-year plan. And the fast growing company, they do 1 year or 3-year plan. But I think they have to look for the longer term, over the longer timeline. The Chinese government, they also give the signal that they have to look for the 2035 plan. So it's the first time they don't just focus on the current 5-year plan. They have the peak goal, but they also have a longer term plan to do the analysis. So for people who are doing planning work in a corporate, they put their eye in the longer future. They have to look at those uncertainties in a way to check or to test the company's vulnerability to the wider factors. For example, the climate, especially in China. I know they've been talking this for long, because China signed Paris Agreement, but we're still doing a lot of education on this. And so what does climate risk mean? The transition or physical risk, carbon, sea level rise, flooding. So those are the new elements for their business, and they haven't paid much attention before. Another thing I like to share, I think it in a good way becomes a race, right? Then one after the other, companies start to announce, and they put a goal on this, or they have a plan to do the net zero. I think there's a good and bad on this. Well, one is, and I think it's apparently they create this market pressure, but on the other hand, I think maybe there's the careless about what does that mean, and there's a different ways of make their commitment, right? Kind of a tricky, and they say we only do net zero for scope 1. It's for a lot of companies, it's not much, or it's similar to business as usual. So I think we need to carefully look at the company's commitment on this. So I think those are some of the observations I see for now. I think I share a lot of comments from the speakers. I think there's a waking trend. I think people forced to see longer, and they forced to see things they don't want to do, and they need to invest, and need to be transparent and be robust on what they're doing to report to their public.
Thanks, Chin. I'm really glad you brought up this issue of time horizons and of corporate planning and investment planning. You know, I was speaking to a friend at Duke Energy just yesterday, one of the largest utilities in the United States, and he's running a remediation project for a now decommissioned coal site, and it will be complete in 2037. And I thought, oh my gosh, like how do you run a project that's going to be complete in 2037? But it showed that kind of long-term, long horizon planning, and the of course vast array of steps between now and then. And your examples of the corporates in China looking toward the 2021 to 2025 5-year plan horizon, also are presumably looking towards national peak emissions and things like that, and then ultimately these net neutrality targets in the longer term. Very important to consider these incremental time steps when we're evaluating these net zero ambitions, both in public and private domains. I also am interested in your comment here on companies needing to be able to justify their activities, to demonstrate their climate consciousness and strategic vision, et cetera. And I recognize that when companies come to you, they're looking for help on that. And so by definition, they're facing some kind of capacity gap or capacity deficit internally. And I wonder, similarly to my question to Rachel about organizational behavior, are you seeing growing capacity in the companies that you're working with on understanding some of the jargon that we've been using in this panel, for example, and understanding some of the considerations on climate risk and climate opportunity that you're an expert on yourself, et cetera? Are there shifting sands in that regard?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's ongoing need for further capacity building, but we, there's a lot of provider or service provider on this in this space over the market. The challenge of Sir Jackson, I think I hear my echo. Thank you. The challenge here is I think it's a systematic, it's not just one issue, right? It's a systematic thing, and it across the board, and it covers a lot of issue. And the people who depends on their job and function, the skill or their knowledge they need to cope with it can vary. So I think the company realized that. So, for example, in a meeting we had, with a big bank, and one of their senior leaders said, let's have some serious learning session follow up. Right? So say they know it's not just one off or several courses. It's an ongoing process. And in the past, we deal with PR, deal with people do the reporting. So you have to let them know the reporting framework, the compliant requirement, etc. But now people are talking more. They're more towards the core business divisions, or even to the senior leaders, right? So they need to know how to integrate those sustainability issue or ESG issues into their own business. They need to also inspire themselves to brainstorm together and to think about the risks as well as the opportunities. Right? So it's not just on let's comply with what required now, but more on if my competitor are doing this, and how we can be better. What are the differences we can make? So it require more on learning the basic, and you can bring to the level that's why we talk more with the strategy people, the long term, also the overall impact on their companies. And Yeah, I think did I answer your question? Or should I feel more information? I think this, so certainly it requires more capacity building efforts, and it needs to be customized and not just cover the basic, and you need to integrate into their business and to be able to find the real solution.
Well, thanks, Jen. I find that answer really encouraging, because you're describing a virtuous competition, essentially, for being more effective in these realms that we're talking about. And one would presume that that might trickle down to HR, to talent acquisition, to skill development, et cetera. I know we have a lot of students in the audience, so we'll end our conversation talking about maybe what some of those skills might be that could help take these efforts forward. We have some questions rolling in through the Q&A. I don't want to stand in their way, but Qian, like Casper, I really must get your take on where environmental markets in Asia and China specifically might fit into this. This is the work that's brought you and I together in the past. Are you seeing growing attention being paid to potential compliance or voluntary greenhouse gas mitigation markets in China by the companies that you're working with? Is this kind of on the periphery or background noise? What are you seeing from where you are?
I lost you for 5 seconds. Did you just ask about the can you repeat your
does China's national ETS and other voluntary market compliance market activities elsewhere in the region, are they growing in relevance or remaining on the periphery for the companies you're?
Okay. Yeah. So we've been working with an ETS for over 10 years, and I work with Casper a lot on this on the China market, and I think the China ETS will go on, and it will take time for them to unify and to kind of form the real price, etc. I want to point out one thing is that so among those companies, the regulator, the government decided to cover, and they are over 2,000, I think. The emission covered, total emission covered is, I think it will still a small percentage of the total emission. I think within power that might even below 10% for the first phase. So what about the rest? Right, we were talking about net zero, so you have to remove everything you produce out of the atmosphere, right? So I think it's important to create a robust voluntary market, and the clients we were talking about, they've been asking because they get it, right? Then they will take efforts to reduce, but until a certain point, it's difficult for them to cut by themselves, and need to find a way to offset or to find the sequestration projects. So I personally believe there's a growing demand on the voluntary credits, carbon credits. I know we're probably you're aware that a lot of the international companies, they're buying renewable energy assets in China to kind of trying to get their environmental equity out of it, so they can claim. This is purely voluntary, and there are also company they invest in new technology, CCS or battery, so, and even biofuel, like company like us. By the way, we also promised 2030 net zero. A company like us, and the main emissions are from office building and also travel. But for travel, like we're not oil companies or transport logistic companies, so it's hard for us to make transformation change. So we would like to work with our partners or vendors to co-invest on biofuel or other type of new technology. So I think this would also encourage more market efforts on a voluntary basis, and then potentially generate needs for carbon credits.
Yeah, thank you for that. Very comprehensive answer. We do see some signs that demand is outstripping supply in some of these voluntary markets, and prices going up as a result, which could have the effect of exacting greater change. At the same time, I think many of these additionality issues that Casper discussed earlier become even more pressing when we add in some of the voluntary market intersections with compliance markets and questions about veracity of credits, et cetera. I will now move fully onto the questions rolling in from our audience. Thanks so much to those of you who are submitting them. I'm going to begin with the question from Gray Lee, and I'm going to actually expand on it a little bit and pass it to Casper. Gray asks, has the pandemic caused any consideration in restructuring business operations, such as working remotely, to help achieve their sustainability goals? I want to add to that, Casper, in terms of the BP, as the pandemic altered your vision of the kind of future supply and demand dynamics of your core products? Or will this be a blip on the screen with a rapid and kind of enormous rebound that will make it just kind of a moment in time that comes and goes?
Thanks for the question. I have to dodge this one because I cannot comment on markets. But I'm going to comment on the remote working in particular. Okay. I think that's an interesting one, because I think lots of companies have realized during the pandemic how well remote working works, and I think remote working can be in support of sustainable goals and can reduce the environmental impact, but it doesn't have to. So I think it's very complex, and it depends on your particular setup. So things to think about, for example, is if you're operating an office building and you have your entire workforce in the office building during summer, an office building is much more efficient to cool down than individual apartments that all run their own AC. So that's one thing. Then from commuting, depending on what's the mode of transport, can be more or less efficient if you have people working from home. So I think it's a very complex issue, and I think it's companies are not at the point where they have fully understood and analyzed the impact from remote work on their environmental footprints. I think right now it's still from a cost perspective where companies say, well, this is great, we can maintain our productivity, but we save on office space. But I think the impacts of remote work on operational footprints, I think that's something that people will need to look at going forward.
Thanks. Rachel, I want to move to you for our next question, and please feel free to chime in on any reactions to the other panel members' comments, things you've picked up in the conversation that you want to highlight, or answers to the other questions I'm not directing straight to you. But Kevin Edmonds asked something that I think you'll have opinions on. He says, how are businesses responding to emerging sustainable financing principles across the region? Are these tools being exploited in full, and what are the barriers to that exploitation? How can they be overcome?
Thanks, and thanks to Kevin, who's an old colleague and friend. And I'm going to give you my opinion. If this is not my part of the field, and then actually probably bounce it over to Chin, because Chin, you probably have additional perspective you can add. In general, I think the banking and finance sector is behind the leading corporates, because the corporates have been working on this for a while. So I think the banking and finance sector is still figuring out what to measure, how to make those metrics applicable across within an industry and then across industries. That's difficult to do. And then how to frame reporting, and also just even analyst conversations in ways that you really get at the core exposure, both the risks and the opportunities of climate change. So I don't think it's working very well yet, but there's a lot of smart people working on it. So I think we're going to get there. I also think that in some ways finance is more international than almost any other industry. And so when the standards start to roll out, even the European Union's taxonomy project, which sounds really like mind-numbing, and I have to admit I haven't read it all, but just getting the language, to be the same, that's important. Once that starts happening, I think that things are going to happen much more quickly. The other thing is, there's this concept that green money is easy money and it's cheap and it's cool, and that may be, but not if you do it right. And here I would actually call out New World, which is a Hong Kong-based conglomerate that's very invested in property development, construction in Hong Kong, China, and probably elsewhere. I don't know the extent of their businesses, but they were the first ones in the world to, and I'm going to actually read this because I thought it was really notable. They were the first real estate developer globally to issue a sustainability-linked bond. It's a $200 million US bond with a coupon rate of 3.75%. So I think it was triple subscribed. But the targets they have to achieve to continue at that rate is to achieve 100% renewable energy for all of their developments in the Greater Bay Area. And let me tell you, the grid in the Greater Bay Area is not based on renewable energy. It's based mostly on coal and nuclear and some gas. So how they're going to do that in the next 10 years, it's going to be interesting to see. But the fact that they had the level of ambition to make that commitment to the market very publicly, and that they're going to do the investment to show how it's going to be, I think that's how it could work, is going to set a real standard for others. And I think that's the way things are going to develop, is you're going to have a couple leading companies. But let me stop now and send it over to Chin.
Thanks, Chen. Anything to add?
Yes, and I think just want to add just a small thing is I think the financial companies, they are picking up quite quickly because it's regulatory driven in Europe and in Hong Kong, for example. They also issued the guidelines for banks to conduct climate risk analysis. So they are picking up tools like transition risk analysis, and they also select companies to do their clients to do the test run. So I think they are moving quite fast, and similar in mainland, the central bank and the regulators are sending very strong signal, but they also don't want to rush it, because the banks they're really big, and there's a lot of assets, and it's not easy to pull out in a short time. So I think they urge people to start looking at the risk within their assets. I saw there another question about this, so I want to respond together. I think the transition and physical, they are equally important. So we encourage when we do advice, and we encourage them to do both, but they don't have to do pick all those factors, and then they can pick those will affect them the most. If, for example, if their assets and along the for example, their real estate guarantee, they are along the coastal region, we would like them to do physical risk on sea level rise. But also if they have a large portfolio on agriculture, we encourage them to do physical risk as well. But if they only invest on energy, then maybe transition like carbon, renewable, also policy, that those factors and would affect the most. So it depends, but I fully agree those are equally important.
Thank you, Chen, and thank you, Rachel, for again giving us an enormous amount of color on these questions in a short amount of time. We are towards the end of our time together, and I am going to try to combine two very big tent questions that we have from the group alongside what I'd love to hear from each of you as closing remarks. And that is, we have a couple of versions of the question, both from Lei Ruan and from Joyce Shuo. So what are the factor, or excuse me, I'll frame it this way. What do you consider as the biggest considerations and relevant factors for companies in Asia to pursue net zero over the next 20 years? And I also would like for you within that, as given that you all are in leadership positions in your relative organizations, and we have many students with us today, to just conclude with a thought or two about what sort of skills and outlooks you would like to see from the graduates that you and your contemporaries are bringing into your organizations. Casper, I'd like to start with you.
Thanks, Jackson. When I think about it from, if I start with the second part of your question, I think that also leads to a very good answer on the first part. So what we want from graduates is essentially, I think, a basic fluency in the concepts and the language that we need to talk about net zero and about environmental impacts. So I think that's very valuable for us if people have a general understanding. We don't need to have, we don't require detailed understanding of methodologies or anything like that, but a general understanding of the issue at stake and how we talk about the issue and what kind of solutions we have out there. I think that's extremely helpful. And then the second thing, I mean, you hear that I think from any industry, is familiarity with working with data and being able to, work with models and visualize data. I think that's something that's just generally super useful if you have that. So I think that's the kind of skills that we're looking for in general. And for a company, for the wider company, I think the key for a company to be able to navigate the energy transition successfully, I think, is really to have these skill sets widely dispersed throughout the organization and not concentrated in one single unit anymore. So it used to be in the past, you had the sustainability guys, they're one department in the company, but I think what we need now is really to have that kind of understanding in every part of the company, so that it is really part of all business decisions and people really understand what's at stake. So I think that's the key success factor for companies going forward, is that from top management to people in implementation, that everybody understands the issue at stake and how to think about it.
Thank you, Casper. Rachel, that's very close, I think, to some of your comments about mainstreaming these issues in broader organizational thinking and behavior. Can you provide answers to the same question, please?
Sure. So let me make it even, I'm American, I'll make it very direct. There is no escape. If you want to be a leader in logistics, finance, marketing, HR, strategy, organization, R&D, development, product, no matter what, you need to understand sustainability. You need to understand the multidimensional forces and the complex converging threats and converging risks that we talked about at the beginning when Dan was doing the introduction. And you need to be able to actually analyze, see the big picture, and then see how it relates to your function, and then execute against that. There's no other way to do it. Integrate everywhere into the business. How do you get there? How do you develop those skill sets? You have to have a really strong general management understanding of all the different parts of the business and how they fit together and how one part impacts others. And also the supply chain, how different parts of the supply chain impact the product. Read widely. I can suggest some, and we can send this around afterwards, but there are some fantastic sort of green business news sites. The Corporate Eco Forum in the US publishes a weekly newsletter, ecobusiness.com out of Singapore, the Green Queen out of Hong Kong, China Dialogue. There's a number of sites to see what are the leading businesses doing in your business, in your supply chain, in your world. So pay attention, be curious, try stuff out. and sort of show up recognizing that we're not on a sustainable path, and you could be part of actually shaping a much better future.
Thank you. I think we might use your "there is no escape" statement as a pull quote for the larger ClimateCAP initiative. That's excellent. Chin, the final word is yours.
Yeah, so we are recruiting, so feel free to reach out, and we like people to. I don't want to confine yourself. I think being a young people, I think you have the privilege to learn and to do anything. But in our specialized team, we look for people who have economic modeling skills, and also if you have some knowledge or background on climate or earth science, that's also perfect. Yeah, I think Catherine and Richard said enough. I think I agree with all of that. I think we all need to step forward and then really to start and take actions. And I think we're talking about climate ambitions, right? And this is all about your personal, and also everybody, can't escape.
Thank you so much, Chin. Thank you, Casper. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you to everyone who has participated. Really appreciate it. I have kept you a couple of minutes over time, so I will only conclude with a brief announcement, which is that for those of you who wish to participate in our unmoderated, informal, but I'm sure compelling discussion session, please note an additional Zoom address for you that I have just placed in the chat. We will begin at 35 minutes past the hour. I also want to thank the Edge Center and my colleagues Dan Vermeer and Katie Cross for their ClimateCAP leadership, and Dan for getting us off to a great start today. We hope that this has been valuable to everyone involved, and that it is the first of many actions that we will help to create that can dive into these issues of business efforts to reach net zero emissions in Asia. Thank you again, especially to our speakers. I'll give my own round of applause. We have recorded the session and will be making it available if you have colleagues and friends who are unable to join us today, and you'll get some notification of that. Thank you again. I'm now going to close our session. All the best.